Chapter 11. Later that evening, after they'd sent all the extra security home, Nick and Rebecca sat in the library. Rebecca was reading a fantasy novel in an overstuffed easy chair, while Nick caught up on business at his desk. Rebecca laid her book down on a nearby table and watched him quietly for a few minutes before she spoke. "I still want to do it." "Do what?" Nick asked absently, his attention on what he was doing. "Seal our mating." He looked away from the computer screen to look her in the eyes, the simple statement having gained his complete attention. "There's no need to rush," he reasoned. "You're safe now. I want you to take all the time you need. Be sure this is what you want. It can't be undone." "I'm sure, Nick. I'm not going anywhere. I love you and I want to be with you for the rest of our lives." She pushed herself out of the chair and walked around the desk, stopping when she reached his chair. "You're absolutely certain this is what you want?" 100%. "Then kiss me. Because I love you too, and waiting for you to not feel pressured into doing it for some sense of security has been killing me." She bent until she could easily meet his lips with hers, her tongue tangling with his as she sank into his eager kiss. She ran her hands over his shoulders, smoothing them down the cloth covering his chest as she deepened the kiss. When he reached for her, she broke the kiss and pulled out of his reach. Smiling seductively, she started across the room. "I'm not gonna do this here. You want some, you'll have to follow me." She pulled her oversized t-shirt off over her head, revealing that she wasn't wearing a bra underneath. She tossed it aside before pushing the short sleep shorts she was wearing off her hips. She never slowed as she let the soft cotton cloth slide down the length of her legs and stepped out of them. All she was left wearing was the thong she'd teased him with the day he'd taken her clothes shopping. Nick watched her walk across the room and out the door before he stood up. He had to adjust himself in his snug jeans before he could follow her. He stepped into the bedroom to find her lying on her side on the bed, still wearing nothing but the skimpy pair of underwear he'd picked out. His fantasy of her wearing them was crushed beneath the reality, it couldn't compare. The sight of her calmly waiting for him, watching him, knowing she wanted only him, made his mouth water. He unbuttoned his jeans and pushed them off his hips as he moved closer to the bed, his eyes never leaving her body. He crawled up the bed to stretch out beside her before kissing her again, touching her only with his mouth. He deepened the kiss, until she lifted one hand to pull him closer. Breaking the kiss, he moved up onto his hands and knees, out of her reach, leaving her laying there gasping for air. He rolled her onto her back and moved over her before lowering his mouth to her neck. Kissing and nuzzling his way down her body, he avoided the sensitive tips of her breasts as he continued downward. He licked and nipped his way down her ribs and over her stomach, wringing her belly button before he licked along the outline of the tiny panties she still wore. Every time she tried to touch him, to grab his hair or guide him with her hands, he caught her hand before she could make contact, gently placing it back onto the bed beside her. He continued moving down her body using his mouth to stimulate and tease her. When he reached her knees, he started moving up again. He eased her legs farther apart and ran his tongue over the barely covered pussy, pressing over the hard button that stood erect against the cloth before flicking the tip of his tongue back and forth for a moment. He moved up again, taking one hard puckered nipple into his mouth while he palmed the other breast, pinching and pulling at the exposed nipple to simulate the action of his mouth on the other. He alternated from one breast to the other, massaging the full round flesh while tormenting the tips. Leaning up, he kissed her again, hard and brief, before pulling away again. He slid the tiny piece of cloth and strings down her legs and off her feet, before urging her knees wide so he could lay his body between them. Looked up at her face, he met her eyes as he lowered his mouth to her core. He watched her face as he swept his tongue up her slit, tasting the cream dripping from her. So sweet and tasty. He smiled before he dipped his head lower to push his tongue deep into her channel, licking, tasting. Rebecca's hips lifted while she moaned, wordlessly begging for more. Nick slid his hands under her thighs and caught her hands as she gripped the bedspread beneath them, so she clung to him as he used his mouth to inch her closer to the pleasure they both knew would send her flying. Nick brought her to the edge only to back off and let it slip away several times. Finally, he gave in, running his tongue the length of her opening, up and down several times before he settled onto her clit, sucking, flicking, and when she was right there, at the precipice, he pinched the sensitive nub between his tongue and teeth, sending her screaming into an orgasm so strong she almost lost consciousness. As she lay on the bed, slowly regaining her ability to think, Nick shifted, moving to lie beside her so he could watch her come back to her senses. He lay on his side, his head resting on one hand while he ran the other along her skin, watching the sensitive flesh quiver and pucker with his touch. The closer Rebecca got to reality, the more she felt of what he was doing to her. The constant onslaught of sensations gave her no opportunity to turn the tables on him. She'd wanted to be the aggressor tonight, but apparently he had other plans. "Wow," she gasped as soon as she was capable of speech. Nick chuckled, his voice husky with desire. That kitten was only an appetizer. He moved over her again, leaning down to kiss her, slowly, deeply sharing with her the passion and eagerness he felt. He lowered his body between her still spread legs, fitting his hips against hers. Sliding his entire body up and down hers, he reveled in the different textures of their skin. He moved until the tip of his manhood rested against her slick opening, sliding it ever so slightly back and forth in the cream from her body, moistening himself. He pulled away from her mouth. "Are you ready for this?" "Nick, now," she demanded. He didn't wait for her to ask again. He plunged deep inside her, sinking to the hilt in one swift thrust. Stopping for a second, his hips flush against hers, he enjoyed the feel of her heat clamping around him, squeezing him tightly. He withdrew and thrust back inside, starting a slow rhythm that he knew wouldn't last. It wouldn't be long, she demanded more. She would soon beg to increase the pace, but he was determined to start slowly, to make this last as long as he could. Rebecca wrapped her arms around his torso, pulling his body against hers, feeling the slide of his skin against hers as he thrust slowly in and out. Burying her face against his neck, she inhaled the scent of his skin. She kissed his neck, working her way toward his shoulder. She scraped her teeth along the taut edge of his trapezius muscle, sending shivers of pleasure down his spine. Her fingers curled into his back, pulling him closer. Feeling her release coming, she slid her hands downward so she could grip Nick's ass and urge him to move faster, push deeper. "Oh, more," she cried out. "Harder, baby." He complied, not speeding his thrusts but pushing a little deeper, using a little more force with each penetration. He tilted her hips slightly, until he could feel the tip of his cock hitting the spot deep inside that he knew would push her over the edge. After several strokes, several sharp impacts against the sensitive spot way at the back of her, he felt her nails dig into his skin as her channel convulsed and clamped her moist heat around him. He didn't slow down or stop, instead he slightly increased his pace, continuing to hit the same spot repeatedly, sending wave after wave of pleasure washing over her. After several minutes, he slowed, letting her recover slightly before he bent and whispered into her ear. "Are you ready for this, kitten?" "God, yes, Nick. I want it all. Give me everything you've got." Still buried inside her, he moved one arm at a time, sliding them under her thighs before bracing them on the bed on either side of her again, her legs sliding along his arms until her knees were bent over his elbows, leaving her splayed wide and bent almost in half. He moved again, slowly at first but swiftly increasing his tempo. The new position let him thrust deeper inside her than she'd ever felt before. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders, pulling him close. She could already feel the wave of orgasm rushing toward her, threatening to wash her away in its intensity. "I love you, Nick. Always," she whispered against his skin, pressing her face into his shoulder. When her orgasm hit, she didn't fight the instinct. She opened her mouth and bit the lower edge of the muscle in his shoulder, sinking her teeth deep. Feeling Rebecca find her ecstasy beneath him, the quivering of her body against his, her heat squeezing around him, and the sharp sting of her bite sent Nick over the edge. He bent to the curve of her neck and bit down as he found his own release. He heard her cry out as he bit her, but he didn't stop, not until he tasted blood. When he released her shoulder, he ran his tongue over the mark he'd left, soothing the ache. "I love you too, kitten. Forever." Don't miss the next book in the series, Jade's Peace.